The battlefield of Europe was evolving faster than generals could adapt. By 1942, the German Wehrmacht, once unstoppable, began encountering the full weight of Allied resistance. Tanks that once blitzed through Poland and France now burned on the steppes of Russia and the deserts of Africa. Men, not machines, were paying the price for a war that devoured innovation as fast as it was born. And in this crucible of desperation, German engineers conceived something almost prophetic, a machine meant to kill without risking a soldier, a weapon that could crawl under wire, slide past barricades, and deliver death remotely. It was called Goliath, a name both ironic and symbolic, for it was barely the size of a motorcycle, yet designed to slay giants. The idea wasn't entirely new. As early as the First World War, the concept of remote-controlled demolition had been imagined in sketches and crude experiments, but only in the chaos of the Second did it truly come alive. In 1940, German troops advancing through France had captured a strange French prototype, a small tracked vehicle called the engin Quegres. It was meant for engineering work, not combat, but in its compact frame, the Germans saw potential. Engineers from Borgward, a company already producing armored carriers, were tasked with transforming this humble contraption into a battlefield assassin. They worked in silence, surrounded by blueprints, steel plates, and urgency. By 1942, the result was a machine barely 3 feet tall and 5 feet long, weighing 370 kilograms with a payload of 60 kilograms of high explosive. It had no crew, no cockpit, no mercy. It was a bomb on tracks, operated from a distance by a soldier with a control box connected by a 700-meter-long cable. The mechanized suicide. The Goliath's mission was simple: crawl toward the enemy, slip beneath tanks, bunkers, or bridges, and explode. To an Allied soldier in a trench, it must have looked like something out of science fiction. A small, whining shape gliding across no man's land, trailing a thin cord behind it, like a metallic serpent. It could be detonated manually or automatically upon reaching its target. The explosion, 60 kilograms of TNT or Amatol, was enough to destroy a tank, obliterate a pillbox, or collapse a bridge. But simplicity was deceptive. The Goliath's first versions were electric, powered by dual motors that hummed softly but needed frequent charging. Later models were fitted with two-stroke petrol engines, louder but more practical for field use. Both types shared the same flaw: fragility. A single bullet or piece of shrapnel could sever the control cable, rendering the machine useless. Its armor, barely 5 millimeters thick, offered little protection against gunfire or even rough terrain. Still, for German planners, the promise was seductive: a weapon that could save lives by replacing human engineers with mechanical expendables. The doctrine of remote destruction. In Hitler's increasingly paranoid mind, technology was salvation. He believed that miracle weapons would turn the tide of war, from jet fighters to ballistic missiles. The Goliath, though small, fit perfectly into this vision of mechanized supremacy. Orders were given to mass-produce the device. By 1944, over 7,500 units had been built. The Wehrmacht distributed them to engineering and panzer divisions, particularly those defending key positions like Anzio, Normandy, and Warsaw. Training manuals were printed. Propaganda films depicted the Goliath as a marvel, the soldier's invisible ally. It was to sneak under Allied tanks, destroy supply depots, and breach fortifications without risking German lives. But in practice, the Goliath faced the cruel test of reality. Battlefields were muddy, chaotic, unpredictable. The control cables snagged on debris, broke under artillery fire, or were cut by small arms.
its tiny tracks jammed with mud and rocks. Its small size made it difficult to navigate uneven terrain. And yet, when it worked, when it reached its target, it was terrifying. Allied tank crews reported seeing small tracked rats rushing toward them, followed by sudden eruptions of fire and steel. Infantrymen tried to shoot at the machines or cutting their control wires. In the confusion of combat, identifying a Goliath from an ordinary piece of debris was often too late. At Anzio in 1944, the Goliaths were deployed against Allied positions dug deep into the beachhead. The Americans, unfamiliar with such a weapon, initially mistook them for observation devices, until one detonated beneath a Sherman tank, flipping it onto its side in a burst of flame. A symbol of fear and futility. The Goliath's greatest weapon was psychological. Soldiers who had never seen one before often froze, unsure how to react to a crawling bomb. The German High Command counted on this fear as a force multiplier. But behind every successful detonation lay dozens of failed attempts. The machines were expensive, around 3,000 Reichsmarks apiece, and consumed critical resources that Germany increasingly lacked. Each loss was more than just metal. It was time, labor, and hope. The men who operated them, called Frontline panzer units, often spoke of mixed feelings. They were safe behind cover, yes, but they watched machines of their own making crawl toward death, sometimes knowing they wouldn't make it. They joked bitterly, calling them beetles of doom. To these soldiers, the Goliath was both genius and madness, a reflection of a war that had lost touch with its humanity. The world takes notice. As the Allies advanced, they captured several intact Goliaths. Engineers studied them closely, fascinated by the idea of unmanned warfare. The Americans dismissed them as impractical, too fragile, too limited, but they took notes. Decades later, those notes would resurface in new forms: remote-controlled demolition vehicles, robotic mine clearers, even the early concepts of modern drones. The Goliath, in its clumsy, cable-tethered way, was the ancestor of the unmanned combat system, the primitive seed of a revolution in warfare. The legacy of desperation. By the war's end, Goliaths were being used more out of desperation than strategy. They guarded bridges, destroyed retreating roads, or were buried in defensive lines as static bombs. The last recorded uses came during the Warsaw Uprising, where German troops used them to blast through barricades held by Polish resistance fighters. To the Poles, it was yet another symbol of German brutality, a machine without a soul, carrying death in its belly. To the Germans, it was one of their final innovations in a war spiraling toward collapse. When Berlin fell, Allied soldiers found warehouses full of unused Goliaths. Some were rusted, others still pristine, relics of a plan that never fulfilled its promise. A mechanical prophecy. The Goliath was a paradox, too advanced for its time, yet too crude to matter. It represented both the genius and futility of German engineering under the Third Reich. It was born of fear, nurtured by desperation, and buried by reality. But its spirit lived on. Every modern drone strike, every robotic bomb disposal unit carries a trace of that same concept, a machine that kills so a human doesn't have to. The Goliath failed to change World War II, but it succeeded in predicting the wars to come.
Chapter 2.
into the front lines. By the summer of 1943, the Goliath had left the test fields of Germany and entered the brutal theater of the Eastern Front. Snow, mud, and the endless echo of artillery became its proving ground. In those shattered landscapes, where tanks froze in place and men vanished into smoke, the German command saw an opportunity for its new mechanical weapon to turn the tide. The Eastern Front was unforgiving. Entire divisions were reduced to remnants overnight. The idea of a machine that could carry explosives across minefields or beneath Soviet bunkers without losing a single soldier was seductive to commanders desperate for miracles. The first Goliaths arrived near Kursk, where the largest tank battle in history was about to erupt. Soldiers who saw them for the first time stared in disbelief. The machines looked harmless, almost toy-like, dragging their thin cables across the mud as they buzzed toward the horizon. "They look like beetles," one Panzer grenadier whispered. The officers didn't laugh. They had seen what those beetles could do. The first missions were simple: crawl towards Soviet strongpoints, detonate wire defenses, and clear paths for advancing tanks. The Goliaths moved slowly, their engines whining through the static-filled radios of the operators. Sometimes they worked perfectly, blasting open gaps where none existed before. Other times, a single stray shell or a jammed track turned them into useless lumps of steel. Soldiers joked bitterly that the machines were as likely to explode on their own as they were to reach the enemy. But in the chaos of Kursk, even unreliable weapons had a place. One German report described how a pair of Goliaths managed to slip under a T-34 tank. The explosion flipped the Soviet tank onto its side, killing the crew instantly. The surviving soldiers watched in awe. It worked. For a moment, faith in the machine flickered alive. Yet, victory was short-lived. The Soviets adapted quickly. They learned to fire at the control cables or simply use machine guns to shred the little machines before they reached their targets. The Germans tried to counter this by deploying the Goliaths in mass attacks, sending dozens across the battlefield at once. But mass meant chaos. The tangle of cables interfered with each other, signals crossed, and some Goliaths turned in circles or stopped entirely. By winter, the Eastern Front had frozen again. The Goliaths that had survived now sat half-buried in snow, their engines useless in sub-zero temperatures. Crews dismantled some for parts, others for warmth, burning their fuel in makeshift stoves. The dream of a mechanized savior was dying in the cold. But the story didn't end there. In 1944, the war shifted westward. Allied troops had landed in Italy, pushing slowly up the peninsula toward Rome. The Germans, retreating but not defeated, brought their Goliaths with them. In the narrow mountain passes and fortified towns, the small tracked bombs found a second life. At the Battle of Anzio, Goliaths were deployed against Allied positions dug deep into the beaches. American soldiers first thought the machines were some kind of observation drones. They learned the truth when one exploded beneath a Sherman tank, flipping it on its side like a toy. Panic spread fast. Soldiers shouted warnings, little tanks," as Goliaths appeared from behind wreckage and dunes. Machine guns opened fire, tracers cutting through the air, but some of the machines still reached their targets. The explosions tore through bunkers and sandbag walls, scattering debris and men alike. Allied engineers quickly learned to cut the trailing wires or lay obstacles to stop them, but not before dozens of casualties. The Goliath had proven that terror could be as effective as firepower. Yet even as it frightened enemies, it frustrated those who used it. The petrol engines often failed to start. The control cables snapped under shell fire. Mud clogged the tracks. And when operators ran out of line of sight, the machines vanished into smoke, sometimes detonating prematurely. German officers began to refer to them as Wunderwaffen ohne Wunder, miracle weapons without miracles. Still, Hitler demanded more. He believed the Goliath could be the prototype for a new era of remote warfare. Propaganda films were made, showing the machine crossing fields, breaching walls, destroying imaginary tanks. In reality, the frontline soldiers saw something else: expensive, unreliable devices that couldn't keep up with the shifting pace of the war. By the time the Allies broke through at Anzio, hundreds of Goliaths had been expended for minimal strategic gain. But they left a lasting impression. Allied intelligence recovered several intact units, studying their wiring and mechanical systems. What they found fascinated them: a crude but ingenious control system, mechanical relays, and a design that balanced simplicity with deadliness. It wasn't enough to change the war, but it was enough to plant a seed. The British began experimenting with their own remote-controlled demolition vehicles. The Americans took notes, recognizing that someday a similar principle, distance without risk, might define warfare itself. For now, though, the Goliath crawled toward its twilight. Its operators, weary and disillusioned, spoke of it like a ghost, something that haunted the battlefield but could not win it. They watched their mechanical comrades vanish into smoke, their cables cut, their engines sputtering. Sometimes they never even saw the explosion, just a dull flash in the distance and silence afterward. In that silence, the dream of victory through machines faded a little more. The Goliath had been born from innovation, but now it marched alongside desperation. And desperation has never won a war.
Chapter 3. The Beaches of Fire. When the morning of June 6, 1944 arrived, the German soldiers along the Atlantic Wall awoke to a world shaking apart. The sound of artillery thundered across the French coast, and from the misty horizon came the largest armada ever assembled. D-Day had begun. For months, Erwin Rommel had warned Berlin that the invasion was coming, that no wall could hold forever. Now, as Allied ships filled the sea, his prediction became reality. Beneath the roar of guns and the whine of aircraft, small German units scrambled to prepare their last line of defense. Among the weapons scattered along the cliffs and beaches were hundreds of Goliaths. They waited in trenches and camouflaged pits, their small forms covered with netting and sand. Operators crouched behind them with control boxes ready, their faces drawn tight with fear and anticipation. For many, it would be their first and last use of the weapon. When the first Allied landing craft hit the beaches, chaos erupted. The air was filled with smoke, sand, and the screams of men charging through gunfire. German machine guns cut into the waves, but the tide was unstoppable. As tanks rolled off the ramps and began pushing through obstacles, the Goliaths were released. From the bunkers above Omaha and Gold Beach, they emerged like insects made of metal, crawling down the slopes toward the incoming armor. The sound they made was strange, a high-pitched buzz that blended with the thunder of shells. Some Allied troops didn't even notice them at first. Others did, and pointed in disbelief. "What the hell are those things?" shouted one American sergeant, before his Sherman rocked under a sudden explosion. One Goliath had reached its target. The blast ripped through the tank's side, killing the crew instantly. The explosion sent shockwaves through the nearby infantry, who dove for cover as shrapnel hissed through the air. For a moment, the German operators believed the tide could be turned. They launched more. 10, 20, 30 machines rolled down the embankments, each dragging its thin control cable like a tail. Some reached the water's edge. Others got stuck in the sand or were hit by bullets before they could detonate. The survivors of the first wave learned fast. They began shooting at the cables, realizing the little tracked bombs were helpless once severed. The moment a cable snapped, the Goliath froze, engines sputtering, motionless under enemy fire. The beaches soon became a graveyard of steel beetles, their small frames burning beside broken landing craft and dead men. Still, the psychological effect was undeniable. Many Allied soldiers described the terror of seeing these small moving machines racing towards them. One British corporal recalled later, "They were like demons crawling from the sand. You knew they were coming for you, and there was nowhere to run." For the German engineers operating them, each detonation was both triumph and heartbreak. They were not cowards hiding behind machines. They were soldiers desperate to survive, trying to fight an enemy that outnumbered and outgunned them. Every time one of their creations exploded, they hoped it bought another minute of resistance. But the minutes were running out. By noon, the beaches were under Allied control. The bunkers fell silent, their defenders either dead or captured. The few surviving Goliath operators destroyed their equipment before surrendering. Allied engineers exploring the captured positions found rows of unused Goliaths hidden in trenches. Some were wired for detonation, others intact. The Americans and British examined them with curiosity. To some, it looked like a child's toy. To others, it looked like the future.
Reports from the field described the Goliath's technical design in detail: the 3 remote control wires, the miniature tracks, the explosive payload. They noted its weaknesses, but also its potential. If it were radio-controlled, one officer wrote, it might be unstoppable. Those notes would later inspire post-war research into radio-guided munitions and remote demolition systems. But on the beaches of Normandy, the verdict was clear. The Goliath had failed to stop the invasion. As the Allies pushed inland through hedgerows and villages, the Germans tried again. Goliaths were deployed in ambushes, hidden behind rubble, or sent down narrow lanes as Allied tanks advanced. The problem was always the same: the cables. The moment they snagged or were shot through, the machine died. The terrain of France was nothing like the deserts or frozen plains. It was a labyrinth of fences, trees, and debris. The Goliath could not navigate it. And yet, despite all its failures, soldiers on both sides spoke of the machine with a mix of fear and fascination. There was something uncanny about it, something deeply human and inhuman at the same time. The sight of a weapon that moved and killed without a man inside seemed to belong to another century. Allied soldiers joked nervously, calling it the Nazi lawnmower. Others didn't laugh. They sensed they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of warfare, one that would no longer depend entirely on courage or presence, but on control and distance. In the end, Normandy was not a triumph for technology, but for numbers and resolve. The Goliaths burned, their wreckage scattered across fields of wheat and blood. The war had outgrown them. What had begun as a miracle of engineering had become a symbol of futility. As German soldiers retreated through the hedgerows, some looked back at the little machines lying broken in the mud. They had built them to save lives, to change battles, to make fear work in their favor. But war had a way of swallowing invention faster than men could create it. The Goliath's short, violent life was ending, not with glory, but with silence.
Chapter 4. The Engineers of a Dying Reich. As the summer of 1944 bled into autumn, Germany's Western Front began to crumble. The once proud Atlantic Wall was breached, and Allied forces were spreading across France like a tide that could not be stopped. Paris had fallen. The Luftwaffe was grounded. Fuel was running out. In the chaos, among the scattered retreats and shattered divisions, a small group of engineers still clung to their hope, the dream that machines could save the Reich where men no longer could. In underground workshops across Germany, production lines continued to hum. The engineers of Borgwood, Zundap, and other firms gathered around blueprints of the Goliath, their faces lit by dim electric bulbs and cigarette smoke. They knew the truth. The Goliath had failed. It was too fragile, too slow, too dependent on its control wire, but they also believed the idea was right. If the Goliath had freedom, it could have been our victory, one engineer reportedly said. Their obsession grew as defeat loomed closer. They began sketching new versions, larger models with thicker armor, stronger engines, and wireless controls. They dreamed of a machine that could crawl through ruins, seek out enemy tanks, and detonate without human guidance. Some of them whispered about making it intelligent, though the technology for that was decades away. They didn't know it, but they were planting the first seeds of what the world would one day call drones. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the reality was far less romantic. The surviving Goliaths were being used in desperation. At Aachen, at the Siegfried Line, and in the forests of the Ardennes, small units tried to deploy them to delay the advancing Allies. But the terrain was brutal. Mud, snow, and rubble clogged their treads. The control wires snapped on trees and barbed wire. Allied soldiers had learned the trick. Aim low, cut the cable, and the thing dies. The little tanks would sputter to a halt, their operators staring helplessly from 100 meters away as bullets tore their machines apart. The Goliath's failures weren't just mechanical. They were symbolic. Every malfunction echoed the state of the Reich itself. Designed for perfection, destroyed by overreach. In the propaganda films, the weapon had been portrayed as a miracle, a precision-guided bomb of the future. In reality, it was a fragile, tragic machine made by desperate men. And yet, even as the front lines collapsed, Berlin ordered more to be built. The engineers obeyed. They had no choice.
In one factory near Kassel, workers were told to produce 200 Goliaths per month. They lacked copper for wiring, rubber for tracks, and fuel for testing. They scavenged scrap metal from bombed vehicles and melted it down for parts. The engineers replaced some copper wires with aluminum, knowing it would break more easily, but there was no alternative. One technician wrote in his notebook, "We are building ghosts. They will never reach the front." But the orders kept coming. As Allied bombers darkened the skies, the factories shook under fire. Entire production lines vanished in minutes. Still, blueprints were carried to safer ground, to underground tunnels and mountain caves. It was as if the Reich believed it could hide its hope in the dark. In December 1944, the Germans launched their final great gamble, the Ardennes Offensive, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge. Amid the snow and fire, a handful of Goliaths were deployed once more. Their mission? To clear minefields and attack American tanks hidden in the forest roads. The results were the same. Few reached their targets. But one incident stood out. A Goliath, guided by a teenage operator, managed to slide beneath an American half-track before detonating, killing everyone inside. The shock of that moment spread through the unit. The soldiers began shooting at every small movement in the snow, terrified of what might crawl towards them next. That fear, the irrational terror of something unseen and unstoppable, was exactly what the engineers had dreamed of creating. Even if the weapon didn't change the war, it changed how men thought about the battlefield. It proved that machines could hunt men. And that realization, whispered in laboratories and later remembered by Allied scientists, would shape wars to come. By early 1945, the Goliath program was effectively dead. The Reich had no more fuel, no more metals, and no more time. Allied forces were closing in from both sides. In the final days of the war, many factories were abandoned. Some engineers burned their notes, others buried them. When the Allies arrived, they found crates of half-built Goliaths, blueprints for wireless prototypes, and letters describing remote combat experiments. To them, it was a curiosity. To history, it was the birth of something entirely new. When the war ended, many of those engineers were quietly recruited by the victors. Some went to the United States under Operation Paperclip, others to the Soviet Union. They found themselves working on rockets, guidance systems, and unmanned vehicles. The Goliath's bloodline continued, hidden beneath new names and new purposes. Its soul, the idea of remote, precise destruction, had survived the fall of the Reich. Back in Germany, ruins covered the cities where the Goliaths had once been built. Children played with their rusting carcasses, unaware of what they were. To them, they were just strange toys of a lost war. And in a way, that's all they were. Tiny, doomed machines built by a nation that believed even its machines could be soldiers. The engineers who survived rarely spoke about their creation. Some were ashamed, others proud. But all of them understood one thing. They had seen the future too soon. The world was not ready for it in 1944. It would be ready soon enough.
Chapter 5. From Ashes to Algorithms. When Germany fell in 1945, the Allies descended upon its factories, laboratories, and hidden bunkers with a single purpose: to uncover everything that the Third Reich had built. Among the wreckage, they found strange machines that looked like miniature tanks, some intact, some torn apart, their cables trailing like veins. To most soldiers, they were curiosities, little more than scrap metal. But to the engineers and scientists who followed the armies, these small machines, the Goliaths, were revelations. The British were the first to analyze them. Teams from the Ministry of Supply brought captured Goliaths to a testing ground in southern England. They dismantled the hulls, measured the engines, traced the control cables, and studied the detonation systems. They were astonished at the simplicity of the design. 2 electric motors, a battery pack, a spool of cable, and an explosive payload. Crude, yes, but brilliant in its intent. The Germans had tried to create a weapon that could kill without risking the operator's life. That single idea fascinated the Allies more than the machine itself. The Americans, too, were intrigued. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, U.S. Army engineers experimented with several captured Goliaths. They tried to improve the concept, replacing the wire with radio control, giving the vehicle better suspension and mounting small cameras on its front. The results were inconsistent, But the ambition remained. The Americans saw what the Goliath represented, a shift in warfare from human presence to mechanical precision. Meanwhile, the Soviets, always hungry for technological parity, scavenged their own share of Goliaths from the Eastern Front. They copied parts, disassembled others, and began developing similar devices, remote-controlled demolition tanks that could carry heavier explosives. In typical Soviet fashion, they built larger, rougher, and deadlier versions, but even they recognized that the Goliath was more than a weapon. It was an idea that would not die. By 1946, military journals in both East and West were already speculating about remote combat. Some writers warned of a future where wars would be fought by machines. Others welcomed it, imagining battles without human casualties. No one realized how prophetic those discussions were. The Goliath, though a failure on the battlefield, had opened a psychological door. Once humanity understood that death could be delivered from a distance, without risk, without remorse, there would be no closing it again. As the Cold War took hold, the legacy of the Goliath was quietly reborn. American engineers who had studied German designs began working on radio-controlled target drones, initially for training pilots. These drones soon evolved into reconnaissance aircraft. The technology spread fast. By the 1950s, both the US and the Soviet Union were experimenting with pilotless planes that could take photographs, carry small payloads, or even deliver nuclear weapons. It was the same principle, scaled up and perfected. The idea that a human could remain safe while a machine ventured into danger. The ghost of the Goliath haunted every prototype. The irony, of course, was that few people remembered where the concept came from. The tiny German demolition vehicle, once laughed at for its clumsy movements and unreliable wiring, became the silent ancestor of the modern drone. Engineers rarely spoke its name. Military archives buried it beneath more successful projects. Yet every camera-guided missile, every remote bomb disposal robot, every unmanned reconnaissance craft owed something to that small, tracked machine built in a collapsing Reich. In 1964, during a NATO technology review, one British officer remarked privately, "The Germans tried this in miniature 20 years ago. It failed then, but look at us now." He was right. The principles were identical: radio control, mobility, precision, minimal human exposure. The difference was that now, with radio technology and better power systems, the dream finally worked. The Goliath's spiritual rebirth reached its peak during the Vietnam War. The U.S. military deployed drones for reconnaissance, dropping sensors and photographing enemy positions. They even used early robotic vehicles to deliver explosives into tunnels. Few of those soldiers realized that the roots of those machines went back to a desperate German experiment in 1944. Even in civilian life, echoes of the Goliath persisted. The same remote control mechanisms evolved into toys, industrial robots, and eventually autonomous systems. The world had moved from crude wire-guided explosives to precision robotics and artificial intelligence. Humanity had learned to delegate its destruction. Back in Europe, historians revisited the war's technological oddities. Most dismissed the Goliath as a failed curiosity, a footnote in Germany's long list of wonder weapons, but a few recognized its importance. In 1982, a British historian named Michael J. Neufeld wrote that the Goliath was the first step toward unmanned ground warfare, a concept that would define the 21st century. He was more right than he knew. Today, the descendants of the Goliath roam battlefields once again. Modern military robots can breach doors, disable bombs, or patrol hostile terrain entirely on their own. Some are the size of a backpack. Others are as large as a car. All of them share a design philosophy that began in the dying days of the Third Reich: remove the human, perfect the machine. Looking back, it's impossible not to feel a strange mix of awe and unease. The Goliath was born from desperation, built by a nation at war with the world and itself. It failed its creators, yet succeeded in shaping the future they could never live to see. It taught the world that technology could think for men, fight for men, and kill for men, and that once such an idea existed, it could never truly die. As the dust settled over the ruins of Berlin, one American officer wrote in his journal, "They wanted to build a weapon that would fight without fear, without mercy, and without rest. Maybe one day we will too." Decades later, as drones hum over modern cities and machines crawl through deserts carrying out silent missions, it's hard not to hear the faint echo of that old dream, the hum of a small tracked vehicle somewhere in the mud of 1944, rolling toward its target, guided by an invisible hand.
Chapter 6: The Machine That Outlived Its Makers. By the time the smoke of the Second World War cleared, millions were dead, cities were gone, and the idea of war itself had changed forever. Nations rebuilt their homes, but they also rebuilt their weapons, this time with a new understanding. The next war might not even need soldiers. And in that understanding, hidden beneath layers of modern technology, the Goliath lived on. It was never the strongest, nor the most successful machine of its time. It failed on the battlefield, was mocked by the Allies, and forgotten by history books for decades. But in silence, its design philosophy crept into laboratories, defense budgets, and the minds of engineers around the world. It had introduced an idea far more dangerous than its explosives: the separation of the killer from the killing. In the late 20th century, as wars moved from trenches to cities and jungles, military thinkers began to revisit the concept of unmanned warfare. The Goliath's principle, remote destruction with minimal risk, suddenly made more sense than ever. From the Middle East to the Balkans, soldiers were once again using small, tracked robots to scout minefields and deliver charges. What had been impossible in 1944 was now practical. By the 21st century, the dream had matured. Satellites could guide missiles with sub-meter accuracy. Drones could patrol the skies for hours, identifying and eliminating targets from thousands of kilometers away. Ground robots could clear buildings, deactivate bombs, and even fight autonomously. The Goliath's crude cable had been replaced by encrypted radio signals, then by AI algorithms capable of making life-and-death decisions faster than any human operator could react. And in that understanding, hidden beneath layers of modern technology, the Goliath lived on. When the Goliath was first tested, German operators were still connected by cable. They could see the destruction they caused, feel the rumble of the explosion, and know they had pulled the trigger. But modern systems no longer required that closeness. A soldier pressing a button in Nevada could end a life in Afghanistan. The screen flickered, a signal was sent, and somewhere far away, metal met flesh. The emotional distance between human and consequence had become infinite. That was the true legacy of the Goliath. In 2015, a historian writing about the origins of military robotics called the Goliath the first whisper of a coming silence. He meant that as machines took over the act of killing, human voices, hesitation, guilt, empathy, grew quieter. The hum of engines replaced the cries of men. The future of warfare became less about courage and more about calculation. And yet, the paradox remains. The Goliath was created out of desperation. It was born out of fear, not ambition. Its inventors wanted to save German soldiers from certain death, to find a way to fight without sacrifice. They never realized they were inventing a philosophy that would outlive them, a world where machines could fight indefinitely because machines never tire, never doubt, never mourn. In a museum in Koblenz, Germany, one of the few surviving Goliaths rests behind glass. Its steel is rusted, its treads frozen, its cable long gone. Visitors rarely stop for long. To most, it looks unimpressive, small, almost toy-like. But those who know its story feel something heavier. They see not just a relic of war, but the beginning of something that still walks among us. Invisible yet unstoppable. A small plaque reads, Leichte Ladungsträger Goliath, 1942. Underneath, in smaller print, remote-controlled demolition vehicle. Nothing more. No explanation, no reflection, just facts. The silence of the display says everything. The Goliath does not need words anymore. Its descendants speak for it on every battlefield where machines move in place of men.
And perhaps that is the most haunting part. The Goliath never achieved victory for the Reich, but it achieved immortality in humanity's imagination. It became the ancestor of every autonomous system, every precision strike, every machine that kills without a heartbeat. When engineers today design AI-driven combat drones or robotic soldiers, few think of that tiny steel box from 1944. But its DNA is in every line of code, every servo, every guidance chip. The Goliath spirit lives on not in museums, but in the circuitry of modern warfare. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it, the faint electric hum of an idea that refused to die. It whispers from the past. We can fight without fear. We can destroy without dying. And humanity, once horrified by that thought, now builds its future upon it. The Goliath has finally won its war.